When you think of Bruce Lee, what comes to mind? Lightning-fast kicks, right? The nunchucks, that defiant yell. For decades, he's been the ultimate hero. But what if I told you his legendary films hold a hidden story? One we can only see through a completely new and honestly pretty surprising lens.
I mean, we all know this image. Bruce Lee, the icon. He's the embodiment of Chinese strength and pride, this singular force of masculine power, standing up against injustice. This is the guy that became a global legend, the hero at the absolute center of every single frame.
Okay, but here's a wild thought. What if we've been watching the wrong characters this whole time? What if the key to unlocking these films isn't in the hero's triumphant moments, but in the anxious faces of the people we usually just ignore in the background?
And that's exactly where this fascinating thesis by scholar Yang Qin comes in. Her argument is simple, but wow, is it profound. To truly get the complexity of these films, we have to look past the hero and focus on the characters who are caught in these in-between spaces of culture and power.
So, the core concept here is something called liminality. The easiest way to think about it is like a cultural borderland. It's that uncomfortable, uncertain space where someone isn't fully one thing or the other. They're caught between worlds, constantly having to figure out who they are. And believe me, this is where all the interesting stuff happens.
So, who are these liminal figures? Well, Chen's analysis zeroes in on 4 key groups that are basically hiding in plain sight. You've got the interpreters, the migrants, the women, and all those anonymous crowds we barely even notice. Let's start with maybe the most compelling example. The interpreters. You know these guys. They're the awkward, suit-wearing men who work for the foreign villains, totally caught between their Chinese identity and their powerful bosses. Now, to really understand these characters, we need to talk about a concept from the theorist Homi Bhabha called mimicry. He argued that colonizers have this really contradictory desire. They want the colonized to imitate them, to be recognizable and controllable, but never perfectly. The copy always has to be just a little bit flawed.
And this tension is everything. The goal is to create a copy that's almost the same, but the reality is that it's always not quite. And right there, in that little gap, that's where the colonizer's authority starts to fall apart.
In Bruce Lee's films, this idea literally comes to life with 2 characters, Wu, the translator for the Japanese villain in Fist of Fury, and Ho, who works for the Italian mob in The Way of the Dragon. These guys are mimic men.
And just watch how they try to imitate power. They've got these ill-fitting Western suits, they speak foreign languages, and they adopt all these exaggerated, kind of cringy mannerisms and accessories. They're basically performing a cheap version of their bosses, trying to get a piece of that power.
But here's the thing. It never works. The imitation is always incomplete, it's over the top, it just comes across as a parody. So instead of commanding respect, they just look awkward and totally powerless. It's mockery, not mastery.
There's this absolutely brutal scene in Fist of Fury that shows you exactly how this plays out. The interpreter, Wu, is desperately trying to prove he's loyal, but his boss Suzuki just humiliates him, forcing him to crawl out of the room like a dog. That is the not quite rule in action. It's a cruel, vicious reminder that no matter how hard he tries, he will never, ever be seen as an equal.
So here's the crucial point. This failed mimicry does way more than just embarrass the interpreter. It's actually subversive. By being such a flawed copy, he accidentally exposes the anxiety and insecurity of the person in power. It kind of menaces the very authority it's supposed to be supporting.
Okay, but the interpreters are just one piece of this puzzle. When we look beyond them, we find all these other marginalized groups, and their stories reveal that there are actually 2 competing ideas of what a nation even is playing out right on screen.
So on one side, you've got the pedagogical narrative. Think of that as the official history book version of the story. It's simple, it's heroic, and it's represented by Bruce Lee himself. But then you have the performative narrative, all the messy, diverse, real-life stories of the actual people. And that's where things get really interesting.
Just look at the women in these films. While all the men are obsessed with this cycle of nationalist honor and revenge, the female characters are often way more pragmatic. They're worried about safety, about running a business, about the future. Their stories are this powerful reality check against all the masculine violence.
And what about the migrant workers? I mean, in The Big Boss and The Way of the Dragon, whole communities of displaced Chinese workers basically form the entire backdrop for the action.
Their collective fears and hopes are the very reason a hero is needed in the first place. Their struggle is the stage for his heroism. And finally, think about the crowds. You know, in Enter the Dragon, we get these quick glimpses of kids on boats, elderly ferry operators, just nameless faces in a harbor. They're on screen for, what, a second? But they represent the countless, untold stories that really make up the fabric of a nation.
So, after all that, what does this mean for Bruce Lee's legacy? How does seeing all these in-between people change the way we watch his movies?
Well, first, let's be really clear. This is not about tearing down the hero. Not at all. It's about enriching the entire story. By actually seeing these other characters, we add these incredible layers of complexity and depth to the world he's fighting for.
What this new lens shows us is that his films are so much more than just simple nationalist fables. They're actually really sophisticated critiques of power. They dig into the anxieties of colonialism, what it means to have a hybrid identity, and they show us that the most important cultural stuff always happens in those messy, in-between spaces.
And you know what's so beautiful about this whole analysis is how perfectly it connects back to Bruce Lee's own philosophy. He famously said, "Be like water," describing something that's totally fluid, adaptable, and formless.
And that is exactly what this reading shows us. The world of his films isn't some solid black and white struggle of good versus evil. When you look at the margins, you see it for what it really is. It's fluid, it's complex, and it's full of the same contradictions and hybridity as water itself.
Which leaves us with one final and, I think, pretty powerful question. If the richest stories in Bruce Lee's films belong to the characters we've always overlooked, then whose story are we missing today? Who are the in-between figures in our own world, waiting in the background, whose stories could change the way we see everything?